Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to the class notes on reading the Canterbury Tales in context. So this week, I'll go over some specific context that I hope will help people as they navigate through the sections of the Canterbury Tales that we're reading. And then from there, I'll say just a few words about how to think about the reading from this week and the reading for every week for the course in terms of some of the larger contexts of what the course is trying to accomplish. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So there are some special challenges with reading the Canterbury Tales. You'll see here in the notes that I've abbreviated that to TCT just for simplicity's sake. And one thing that I've tried to do here is bold any key terms, literary terms, especially the kind of thing that might come up again in a midterm or final exam. So with that said, one thing that I recommend to everyone is that you should all spend extra time reading marginal definitions and footnotes. This is something that I went over in last week's class notes, but this week in particular, and I think really for the next few weeks, we'll see this come up with Othello when we read Shakespeare, for example. But this week in particular, I think presents a lot of challenges and really makes for some very slow reading. It takes me a long time to read through the Canterbury Tales, just with trying to read through the marginal definitions, the footnotes, trying to just figure out what's happening line by line, stanza by stanza. There's kind of a lot to process there, and so you're going to want to really give yourself the time to do that. The text is just loaded with both kinds of information, marginal definitions and the footnotes, and so you should find a system that works for you. So, for instance, when I read something like the Canterbury Tales, I just get used to looking in the right-hand margin at the end of every line and of watching for and reading footnotes as I encounter them. I really actually find myself reading very differently than I do even for last week for Beowulf, that had some of this, but not really nearly as much. Is I would sort of glance ahead at times to see like, oh great, I've got 5 lines coming up with no marginal definitions and no footnotes, and I knew I could kind of just read through that and try to make sense of it on my own. It takes a little bit of getting used to, because when you look at that stuff, especially the footnotes where your eye has to move down the whole page, it can pull you out of the flow of making sense of the reading itself. So it takes me a little while, and I expect it takes everyone a little while just to get used to that kind of moving back and forth. If you find a better system that works for you, then go for it. There are some times when I'll just say, you know what, I'll only look at that material if I'm really confused, and I won't look at all of it, or I might stop at the end of every sentence or every stanza and look back over the material to help me out. So find a system that works for you that helps you kind of get into some kind of reading flow while also understanding what you're reading. Another thing that you should focus on doing, just like last week, but here even more so perhaps, last week with Beowulf, we had a modern translation, so we didn't really have to deal with, in that case, it would have been Old English, and all the strange nuances of spelling and vocabulary that we would have encountered had we read an Old English version. Here, we are reading a translated version in the sense that some of the spelling's been modernized. There have been some editorial changes made, but it's much closer to Middle English than it is to Modern English, and so there's a lot of weird spelling in there. So what I would recommend doing is reading out loud. Something we've been talking about, sounding out words in your head, perhaps. Help you to become accustomed to the unusual spelling of Middle English. In pages 19 through 25 of our textbook, there's some help with this, where the editors basically explain like how in Middle English different letter combinations actually are make different sounds than what we're used to as modern readers. I don't find that very useful, because I just can't remember that. Well, I've looked at the material, but it's hard for me to keep that in mind while I'm actually looking at the primary text. So I just kind of make my way through and try to sound it out on my own, and oftentimes just by saying it out loud, even if the spelling is different than what we're accustomed to, if you say it out loud, you can kind of hear the modern word in the Middle English word, and you can get to the right place. So an example here is just the first 4 lines of the poem. When that April with his showers suit, the drought of March hath pursed the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which thereto engendered is the flower. And so what I have underneath that is a translation that includes any of the definitions of words that were given in the marginal notes or the footnotes. I changed those around, and then I just modernized the spelling even more. So the translation I came up with was, when that April with its showers fresh, the drought of March has pierced to the root, and bathed every plant's vein in such liquid, by the power of which engendered is the flower. Now, this is still kind of a word-by-word rendering, right? And when you first encounter it, it still is going to take a little bit to ask, okay, what's actually being described here? Because the sentence structure is very strange, right? It's not a straightforward sentence, and we're going to encounter that a lot in the Canterbury Tales. So if I were to take this to kind of a next level translation, like try to put it into just simple, straightforward English, I might translate this as something like, when April brings its fresh showers to freshen the roots that have been dried out from the drought of March, and the plants have sucked up all of this rain, that's what gives flowers their life and energy. That's kind of a little awkwardly done because I did it line by line, but the sense there is that these flowers are sucking in the rain that's fallen in April. So the most important thing here really is the idea that, hey, it's spring and flowers are blooming again. That's what's being said there. But you need to kind of work through all those different levels of understanding. And when I'm reading, I'm not doing what I'm talking out loud right now. I'm not doing this in full detail. A lot of it's happening sort of just in my head as I'm reading along. As I'm reading, I'm thinking about what's going on. I'm reading out loud. I'm making sure I just understand the basic gist of what's going on. And then in my head, I'm trying to make sense of, oh, okay, it must be springtime because these are the months. This is what's being described. In addition to just contending with the spelling issues and some of the sentence structure, at the end of every stanza, clarify for yourself what was the point of that stanza, what happened in it, or what was described. So remember that you can identify stanza breaks anytime that there is an indented line, which indicates the start of a new, should say new stanza, that's a typo, much like the start of a new paragraph in prose writing. Note that some poetry will sometimes use a line break or gap between lines to indicate a stanza break instead. So just the example here, this is also from the Canterbury Tales. And made forward early for to rise, to take our way there as you devise. Period. Now that ends that stanza, and that stanza had gone on previously for many lines. I just took the last two lines out of it. And then you could see the indent right there. Right here's our indent. That means we're onto a new stanza. Often a stanza break indicates a shift in subject, a shift in focus, a shift in tone perhaps. But nonetheless, while I have time and space, ere that I further in this tale pace, then it goes on from there. So I just want to be clear, when we're talking about a stanza break, that's what we're referring to. Stanzas can be anything from a line to many, many lines, dozens, hundreds, depending on the poem and the poet. In the Canterbury Tales, a lot of stanzas tend to be, I don't know, off the top of my head, I guess anywhere between 15 and, 30, 40 lines, something like that. Some of them get a little bit long. But they are being used intentionally. Like in the prologue, a lot of times, each stanza focuses on like one character, for instance. So what's nice is that those stanza breaks give you a visual cue to pause, ask yourself, okay, what just happened in that previous stanza? Thus, the new stanza here, as I just said, starts with the phrase, but nonetheless, and it continues right up to the next stanza break, which in this case was line 43, which you would see if you were following the text in your book. So the remainder of what I have in these notes are intended to help you read Canterbury Tales within the context of the time period and of other course content. So when it comes to reading the general prologue, and basically I assigned the general prologue and then the Miller's Tale. For the general prologue, keep in mind that the basic frame narrative is very simple. A range of characters across all social classes and occupations are journeying on a pilgrimage to a holy site in England. So a frame narrative is a story that serves as the main narrative in which other stories are embedded or told. So here in the Canterbury Tales, for instance, the frame narrative is the story of the travelers who are meeting at the beginning and going to Canterbury. So that's kind of like the main story. And then the stories that they tell each other as they travel are situated in or embedded in that larger frame narrative since they are telling them as they travel. But the story of their journey is the main story of the poem. So the frame narrative is like that. Think of it as a frame around a photograph or a painting. It frames the other stories. So the story, the frame narrative that's introduced in the general prologue, begins at an inn where all the characters are staying with a host who decides that they must all tell their stories to pass the time on their journey. So, in the same way that now when we go on a long car trip, we play games, right? We listen to music. We might listen to the radio. We might tell each other stories or read it out loud to each other, whatever we're doing to pass the time. The host says, hey, let's pass the time by telling stories. And this is a quote right from the general prologue. The host says that each of you, to short with our way, in this voyage shall tell in tales tway. To Canterbury word, I mean it so, and homeward he shall tell in other two, of adventures that whom have befall. In other words, he's saying, hey, on the way there, everyone tells two tales. On the way back from Canterbury to London, everyone tells two more tales. Tells two more tales. It's a tongue twister. Again, so this is the host's idea, and he says it'll be like a competition. We'll see who tells the best story. The host then accompanies them on their pilgrimage to Canterbury. So the prologue is intended as an introduction to all the characters and is meant to be humorous. So I'm hoping that as you're reading it, you'll find some parts are intentionally funny, sometimes sort of maybe laugh out loud funny, sometimes more ironic or satirical. But it's often done at the expense of pointing out some kind of hypocrisy involving the character and the type of medieval role in society that they represent. So you see with a lot of the characters, there is sort of two things going on where we're being given this sort of portrait of each character in miniature, giving lots of details about them. But at the same time, some of those details or some of the things the character does seem to be at odds with who they're supposed to be or what their job is. And that's intentional. So pay special attention to when that's happening. As you read the introduction, consider the following questions. What kind of details about various characters does Chaucer pay regular attention to? One thing that's very obvious is he talks a lot about what people are wearing. So notice that. Ask yourself, why is he paying so much attention to this? Why does it matter so much what clothes they have on, what kind of hoods they have, what kind of jackets, what the material's made out of? Why is he doing this? How does each of his descriptions add to your sense of the character and how he wants us to view him or her? So that's kind of the big overarching question I want you asking as you read the general prologue. When you get to the Miller's Tale, again, in terms of the plot, it's actually pretty basic. You've got three men, John, Nicholas, and Absalom, who you meet at various points in the narrative, are fighting over one woman, Alison, for her affections. So when you're reading The Miller's Tale, I want you to pay attention to how each of the four main characters are portrayed. How is Chaucer representing them? Do you think we're meant to root for any one character or feel that any character comes out on top? What might be the consequences for social life given the implications of this story and what it suggests about communities and about the relationships between men of various classes and between those men and the women, in this case the woman, they try to woo in bed. So one thing also to keep in mind here is that this tale is told in response to The Knight's Tale. Now, we didn't read The Knight's Tale, but I had assigned for you to read the very short summary of The Knight's Tale. And as you read there, that Knight's Tale is a heroic tale of chivalrous romance and chivalry and sort of high-minded values. And this is a very different kind of story. So that contrast there is really important to keep in mind as you're reading. In the introductory materials about Chaucer and about the Canterbury Tales, you learned something about the pilgrimages that were being done to Canterbury. That's really important context here. So this is it is a religious voyage to pay homage to go to this shrine to pray. Often people would go on these pilgrimages to, because they had sort of a goal in mind, maybe to help out with someone that was sick in their lives or themselves that was sick, or to hope or pray for better fortune, or for any number of things, all the things that even today that we all still might hope and pray for in our lives. In the upper left corner here, you'll see that I included just a little map of the voyage that they would have gone on. If you go on Google Maps, it's kind of cool. You can just track out their journey. And I think when you put in, if you do it by foot, I think the Google Maps said it was something around like 16, 17, 18 hours of walking. So I just thought that was kind of cool and interesting that we can do that. And people still go on that journey now. Partly the pilgrimage now is about retracing this literary text and not so much a religious voyage. But anyway, down here is a picture of Canterbury Cathedral itself. Over here we have a famous painting of some of the pilgrims. And then if you follow this link, it's pretty cool. I mean, there's so much stuff online about the Canterbury Tales, as I'm sure some of you are going to discover. Please, by all means, put that up in discussion board under the forum that I've created for people to share online resources that they find. But this one I just thought was really cool because it lets you do a virtual tour of Canterbury Cathedral. So you could just pop in there and kind of look around and see what was so inspirational for the people who went there. So the last thing I want to talk about here is just how you're thinking about each week's readings in relationship to the readings that have come before, the readings that are going to be coming up. So each week, in addition to focusing on the readings for the week and using any preparatory and introductory materials to help you appreciate and understand the week's primary text, you should also be thinking about how this week's readings relate to the previous week's readings. So maybe, in the back of your mind, or maybe when you're done and writing up your discussion board post, you might be thinking about that. Sometimes the questions that I ask in discussion board might help you to think about making some of those connections. But always, if you see those interesting connections there, make note of those, whether you're commenting on them in discussion board or just writing about them in your own notebook. And this is also the kind of thing that I'm really going to emphasize in the midterm and the final exams. So one of the main virtues of a course like the one we're taking is that by covering such a long stretch of literary history in such a short time frame, we're able to see connections across time and across literary texts. Thus, we can pay attention to how, for instance, Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales might have areas of overlap and also ways in which they diverge. How, you might ask, do both long poems represent the ties that bind communities of people together? So here are some themes that you might want to track all semester long, from now until the very end. Themes about community. What defines a community? What bonds unite people together? What forces work at pulling them apart? Who gets left out of a community or is intentionally kept on the fringes of a community? National identity is another major theme. How do various kinds of communities unite within the sense of a national identity, especially as we begin reading Shakespeare and the writers who come after him? And we'll see when we get to Shakespeare and beyond that we really start to get this idea of Englishness and then Britishness really coalescing and coming into form. Themes of core values. What core values do various characters in a literary work seem to cherish? How do the values of different characters come into conflict? How do those values change over time? Paying attention to gender and sexuality. How do perceived biological differences and differences in sexual practice and or orientation shape a text's representation of its characters and the communities that they form? Class and social status. What role does a character's class, his status in society, or his occupation play within a text? And now we could say her here as well, and we see some of that obviously somewhat this week in the Canterbury Tales. And once we get to Shakespeare and then beyond, we'll see female characters playing much more of a dynamic and active role in as agents, as characters in their own right. So we could certainly put her here as well. Although up to this point in our readings, the his is somewhat appropriate in that most of the characters we're looking at with Beowulf and with Canterbury Tales are mostly male characters so far. Religion and ways of knowing. What does faith look like within a literary text? What faith practices are rewarded, which are not? And what is the meaning of faith? And then finally, race and ethnicity. How is otherness defined within a literary text? And how does race or ethnicity function in a text to help define different communities and their values? This is going to come right to the forefront when we get to Othello. So as you post your responses on discussion board this week and going forward, push yourself to make some of these connections between texts and time periods by asking these questions, and always wondering about changes that you see across time and across authors.